I've been asked to say a few words about how you might measure the impact on an economy from manufacturing. And I came across this company, which you've heard Mr. Okoli talk about a year ago through someone who came on one of our training courses. And I was intrigued because I sat with this chap and we said, right, okay, but how do you measure the impact of this manufacturing? We've heard the jobs word mentioned. But are there other ways to measure the impact? And most important, is the way that we measure it going to affect whether or not there's more investment in the future in manufacturing? Because above all, and I'll try and keep this quite short because you're all trying to get to lunch, but effectively metrics, the way in which you measure local content, KPIs, key performance indicators, the way in which you measure it, over the last 10 years that I've been looking at this subject, I've come to the conclusion that it's woefully underrepresented as a driver for how local content turns out in practice. And what I mean is, if you look at legislation, there will be some definitions, some metrics of local content in that legislation. There may be a definition for local supplier, maybe to do with ownership, maybe to do with location, maybe to do with registration for corporation tax. There will be probably a definition somewhere in that legislation. When it comes down to concession contracts, PCAs, the same definitions may have flown down or they may have mutated and turned into something else. And then when it comes to contracting and procurement and hiring, again, we need to look closely at what is it that is actually being defined. How is citizenship being defined? What are the questions in the invitations to tender, and what are the evaluation criteria that then reward a company for what they offer on local content? There are metrics hidden away in all of that, and it's driving behavior. So I thought what I'd do is just spend 5 minutes just unpacking that in the context of this particular manufacturing company that we've been hearing about, PCMN. Okay. First thing to say is, looking at this company and from my own experience around the world, is that as you're choosing these metrics, as a regulator, particularly Ernest, you will have gone through some of this thinking. There are two parts to it. One is you need to know where public policy is heading on this. You need to know whether the government, for example, Mozambique, is very keen on developing jobs right now. It's more keen on that than just about any other metric of local content. Whereas in Nigeria, you want to see inward investment, long-term sustainable industry that's going to generate jobs over a long term. There are other countries where the key driver is ownership of the companies that provide those goods and services. There are different priorities, and it's not always possible to have it all. You might want to ask companies to report it all, but in the contracts and that are awarded and the submissions presumably looked at by the monitoring board, there will be weightings on what the contractors are offering between employment, ownership, inward investment, supplier support, training, etc., etc. And those weightings will be driven partly by public policy. The other aspect is you need to line up with commercial reality. And if you look on the left here, and I know some of you at the back might not be able to see this, but what's highlighted at the bottom are two models of local manufacturing for paint in a country. One is an international company who invests themselves, registers in the company, and then invests themselves and establishes a manufacturing. And the other is a licensing model, which we've just been hearing about. What might be measured in one of these investments in manufacturing? So here we have ownership on top right, how much is invested, how much might be reinvested of recuperating profits, training, employment, perhaps in different positions, how much is imported in terms of raw materials, the cost of that versus the value add that's added in the company, and then the range of services and products that are provided. There's a lot of different parts of that manufacturing operation which could be measured. There's a local content component and possibly a suitability of business for the market. Second thing to ask is, whose perspective are we talking about here? Is it the manufacturer or the buyer or the regulator or policymaker that we're thinking of when we set these different metrics on how to measure what the manufacturer is doing? Because the regulator will be driven by the policymakers, the buyer may be driven by schedule and project concerns, and the manufacturer may be driven by intending to grow their own market. So the perspective is quite important as well. So now we get into the fun stuff. If we look along the top, and I read it out for you, here are some metrics for measuring local manufacturing, from left to right. The dollar spend, and this is through the perspective of, say, a buyer reporting back up to a regulator. So the first metric is the dollar spend with a nationally registered supplier. And if you look down the side here, we've got our 3 different types of manufacturer, well, a supplier of manufactured goods. The first one on the top is simply an import agent sitting there with a phone and a desk and arranging for imports of paint. The second one is the international paint manufacturer who's invested in their own operations in country and they've registered themselves in that country. And the third one is a license model where the ownership of the company is wholly owned by, in this case, a Nigerian company. So as you go along the top, the spend with national registered suppliers, let's just take a look at that one, that'll probably give you 100%, the national owned company is registered in country. In fact, they're all registered in country, okay, down. So all of them, if your metric is how much you'll be spending with a nationally registered supplier, they'll all score 100% of that dollar value that you've spent. Next metric, dollar spend with national owned companies. Well, the supplier agency, he's set up his own company, so he's 100%. That's here, second column along. But the international company is not a nationally owned company. So if your metric for measuring local content was how much you're spending with a nationally owned company, they'd score 0. Whereas under the licensing model, which is nationally owned in Nigeria, they score 100%. Let's keep going. Along the top, if we come to number of nationals employed in the company, I think in the, this is percentage, as a percentage, so number of nationals as a percentage of total population. Well, in the first company, which is a nationally owned supplier who's an import agent, okay, 1 or 2 people, but there's 100% of those are nationals. When it comes to the international company, probably we're going to find that there is a maybe 5 expats, 10 expats in that company. And there'll probably be less expats in the licensing model. And that's the case, and I verified that this morning in conversations with PCMN. When it comes to the positions of those people, the number of nationals in senior management positions, it starts to look more different. You'll have the director of the small supplier company. He'll be all, the sort of main senior position will be 100% national. But those expats in the Nigerian registered international company, most of those expats will not count as nationals, and you may have some managers and foremans who are nationals. In the licensing company, which is wholly owned, more of the directors, more of the senior managers, the foreman on the floor, they'll be nationals. Dollar value contributed to the economy. Now, in the last year's conference, I think Ernest, you started putting up possible formulas for calculating the actual value left in the economy. And then when we get to the panel, it'll perhaps be interesting to see where you've got to on that. But Brazil, Kazakhstan, Indonesia, these countries try to calculate the actual value that gets left in the economy. And I'm going to jump ahead, because time's short, to that particular point there. So I'm going to jump to this one, dollar value contributed to the economy. Okay? You can't read this, but these are the formulas that some of you will be familiar with that are used to calculate the actual value left in the economy. And the way they basically work is they're primarily driven by what's called a build-down method. They say sales value less imported components, raw materials and goods, and expat labour, but they leave in the country the expenses and the social taxes for those expats. They take away the foreign component. That's predominantly how they work. If you start to apply that to our 3 different types of manufacturers, it gets quite interesting. So let's take this one here, the materials component. Well, the cost of the materials for the supplier agent, that's the main piece. And they'll be paying a large markup back to the exporting country company for that. So probably left in the country is somewhere small overhead and a small profit margin for the supplier agent, maybe 20%. And you sometimes hear these supplier agents called Mr. 10%. You've ever heard of that? That's what it's referring to. You know, the bulk of the value of that sales price is going straight out the country. Okay? When it comes to the 2 models, the registered manufacturer, the international one, and the Nigerian owned, broadly speaking, the cost of the imported raw materials for that manufacturing process is going to look roughly the same. Where it starts to look different is in the labour and the overheads and profit. The labour costs for the Nigerian registration manufacturer, we've got more expats sitting there, okay? So if you're stripping out, and that's what are in these numbers, if you start to strip out the foreign component, you're going to strip out a higher number for the international registered company than for the nationally owned company, which is the 10K versus the 5K, because there are more expats involved, and you can make assumptions about where those salaries are going. Probably they're going out the country, although expenses do stay in. And then when it comes to, just a second, got that wrong. When it comes to the overheads and the profit margin, on the nationally registered manufacturer, there'll be a higher overhead going out the country. And you see that in the Brazilian method. They actually have explicitly, they say, what is the overhead that's going to go foreign from the goods bought in Brazil? And if it's, a registered manufacturer, international one, a higher overhead is going to go out, and certainly, most likely, the profit margin will go out. Whether that's reinvested again later on is questionable and often unlikely, because they past that first initial investment, they'll want to see how that investment goes. Whereas for the nationally owned company, the licensee, it's a nationally owned company. They've raised their own capital. The profits are going to stay in the country, and the profits are going to be reinvested. But the piece that goes out is the license piece, the royalty needs to go out. Okay? So the point of showing you these slides is really to say that it does matter how you decide you want to measure local content, particularly in manufacturing, and even down to these complex formulas that you see increasingly being adopted by regulators in Brazil, Kazakhstan, Indonesia, and we may see the same in Nigeria. It is important to look quite closely at what behavior you're then driving by which metrics you're choosing and which formula you're choosing. So just here's a summary, last two slides. Regulators have, and buyers, national and international oil companies, they have choices about how they measure their local content. They can try and bundle everything up using a clever formula and have a single figure, which can be fairly meaningless but allows for comparisons. Or they can have lots of different metrics all running together, telling different stories, telling a story on ownership, telling a story on training, telling a story on value in the economy. Very important for the sort of company we've just been hearing, how far down the supply chain will those metrics be driven? So Kazakhstan recently has been playing with how far down can they push this. The PCMN sometimes is the third-tier contractor. They're selling paint to a major construction contractor who may be working for an EPCM contractor who has the contract with the IOC. So is anyone setting metrics that will track right down to that third-tier level? And if they are, how is that working, and is it driving the right behavior? Off-the-shelf indicators versus the sort of complex formulas we've just been looking at. Off-the-shelf would be something like man-hours, national man-hours, which you can easily get from your HSE data. When you look at these complex formulas for the value to the economy, there's a very clear choice to make between a build-down and a build-up method. I think that's enough for that piece of the conversation. You can ask me more about it over lunch if you wish. A few other points. Whose data is this? Are you going to ask the suppliers to provide data, or are you, the buyer, going to provide the data, or are both of you going to provide the data and it gets combined in some way? Do you need to add new fields to your SAP, to your financial systems, to your procurement data systems? Are you going to have to start changing the way, as a supplier or a buyer, the way in which you actually record and measure your purchases so that you can capture this data? And Ernest pointed to some fields, some metrics that are going to be loaded into your pre-qualification system in Nigeria. And then finally, what is it, how often are you measuring? By invoice, by contract, by overall supplier? If it's a pre-qual system, it'll be by overall supplier, because there's no specific contract attached to that. And then who's going to verify all of this? Some of you may know that in Brazil, there is a complex set of licensed certifying companies that work with the major suppliers of goods and services, certifying how much local content there is. It's an entire industry in itself now. And any regulator going down that route has to understand the bureaucracy they're about to unleash, and whether those bureaucracies can work efficiently, or whether they act as an obstacle to project development. So in conclusion, if I'm allowed, Sigokoli, I'm going to conclude for you, if that's all right. It's just 3 points. The paid industry was presented by a colleague arguing it's an important part of petroleum development. There's a lot of revenues in paint manufacture around the world, in the billions of dollars, but you don't often see it because it's 2 layers or 3 layers down the supply chain. Licensed technology is an interesting model as opposed to direct investment or a startup by an indigenous company, and some of the benefits of that licensing model have been presented today. He's compared those benefits to some other models, and I think one of the key advantages is the speed at which manufacturing can be got going. You can rely on the indigenous companies to try and access the finance, maybe with support, and the licensing model is a very rapid startup model, which lends itself to countries trying to develop manufacturing. From my perspective, I think there needs to be a little bit more thought on how this is actually going to be measured. If you are going to evaluate bids partly on, for example, the amount of manufacturing, then what are the criteria for evaluating those bids? Okay, and will it drive the right behavior? And from whose perspective are you thinking about this? The regulators, the operators. And then my final point to you, and my lesson of the last 10 years looking at this subject, is that metrics should not be an afterthought. It's not the thing that comes at the end. The Nigerian Content Development Act has a list of targets at the back of the Act, and those acts have metrics tied to each of them. So it can come in at a legal basis, it can come in concession agreements, those metrics, definitely in the contracting process, and then in reporting back on performance of contract delivery. So metrics is very important, and if it is important, then we all better choose the right metrics to drive the right behavior. Thank you very much.